What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to be doing a little bit more of an analytical video and less of a dogcast type of thing where I actually jump into Logic and show you something from a session. I wanted to do kind of a takeaways video from something that I've been watching recently, and I think it's pretty interesting to explore different formats, and you can let me know at the end of the video if you agree with this or if you enjoyed this. But basically today I wanted to cover 10 main takeaways from Dirk Ehlert's newest live stream that he did with a bunch of mixing and mastering engineers. It was a fantastic video to watch and just to learn a lot from. Me personally, if you know my style of music and my mixing process, I like to mix my own music, and I kind of do like a quick mastering process at the end, but I don't consider myself like a professional mixing or mastering engineer by any means. So it's always nice to watch someone else work and share their insights and to learn from them. So in this roundtable, he calls it, Dirk actually invited quite a few, like I said, I think it's 4 other people to that roundtable. And he, among them was Alan Meyerson. Alan Meyerson is a very well-known film scoring engineer, and he did a lot of major motion films. So it was great to have him on, as well as the others, Joel, John, and Ian Shepard. And he's known mainly as a mastering engineer. And then, of course, Dirk is the host. He does a lot of, I think he does all his mixing mastering himself, which is awesome. So anyway, let's go into these 10 takeaways right away. In case you don't have time to watch the entire video, these are kind of the main points that I drew from the roundtable. So number 1 is that adding a single live instrument to your mockup can do wonders. Okay, adding a single live instrument into your orchestral mockup can do a lot for your mockup. You've probably heard this before, and you might think that this is not as much of a mixing tip or a mastering tip, but actually it kind of is, because if you're trying to make a mockup sound realistic and you're trying to get the best out of it, it can really help sometimes to get the flavor of a real musician performing a real piece of music and layering that on top of your MIDI instruments, especially when it comes to orchestral music. Technology is so wonderful nowadays that we can, count on our instruments to do lots of articulations, lots of legato, beautiful expression, but nothing is really going to amount to the realism and the beauty of a real performer performing an instrument. So as an example, I can share that, I did a project with Tina Guo where I arranged an original piece of hers, and basically I added on an entirely new section to her main idea. So I extended the piece to about 3 minutes or so, and she actually had the bright idea to record herself playing the melody line in that new section on top of it. So I ended up mixing her live performance in with a mock-up, after she sent that to me, and I think it really brought the entire thing to another level. I mean, I thought it sounded good before when I did the mock-up, and then I layered in her performance, and all of a sudden it just elevated to a new level. So if you haven't heard that yet, just search up Homeward Bound Tina Guo on YouTube, and you'll find that performance. But anyway, that's really the first point. So adding in a live instrument when you can afford it, or even if you just ask a friend to record something, that can really benefit a mock-up if you're trying to go for like a realistic result, even if it's just a solo cello, solo violin, solo flute, solo trumpet, whatever it is. The second tip was actually from Alan himself, and he said that you don't need as much as you think. So I think the question was, if you had to recommend some mixing tips for beginners, what would you say? And this is something I like to say a lot of my videos as well, but basically less is more. So if you learn your tools, you learn your basic tools like EQ and compression and reverb. Those are kind of like the big 3 when it comes to a lot of styles of music, but especially orchestral EQ and reverb are up there. You might find yourself wanting to do a lot with your mix, right? To actually get it to sound better. And it always feels nice to tweak knobs and pull up faders and do all these little things. But you might find that whatever you do, it's a little bit overkill because you really want to hear that difference. However, mixing is all about subtle moves, in my opinion, especially when it comes to orchestral music. So what Alan said was his 20% rule. So whatever you do, back it off by 20%. Chances are that you'll end up with a nice, clear, and balanced mix because you're adding more subtlety rather than making huge decision making moves. You know what I mean? So that he calls that his 20% rule, but yeah, so essentially what you do, back it off by about 1/5. So back it off by 20% and see how that sounds. So less is more is typically what we say here in the mixing land. And And then number 3 is another tip by Alan. And he said, let a more experienced engineer set up a template for you or make some recommendations or, show you his workflow. But essentially, it's always nice to have a mentor of sorts to show you and share with you their experiences. And it's really a direct way for you to learn and improve very quickly. So for me personally, I have a few friends who are, awesome producers, and they do their own mixing as well. And so when I was starting out, I showed them a piece of music and they would say, oh, how come there's so much high end here? Or why is this mid-range so present? So I would actually watch them do a couple of moves, and it, hearing that difference really inspired me to be like, okay, I need to learn more about this to actually understand how, EQ really works. And of course, having these YouTube channels online, giving you this information, most of it is pretty good. Self-learning can be great. But again, if you have a mentor or someone you look up to, someone who's more experienced than you in terms of mixing or mastering or anything of that nature, it's always nice to let them work a little bit and for you to critically watch and make some notes, if that makes sense. So that's tip number 3. Let a more experienced engineer set up a template for you or just show you something so you can really learn from that directly. The 4th tip was from Dirk himself, actually. He said, having a second pair of ears in mixing and mastering is very important to remain objective, right? And this is pretty self-explanatory. So when we're mixing our own music, sometimes we spend hours on it, right? And we feel like, like it's coming along, it starts to sound really good, but then our ears start to get fatigued a little bit. And that's why many people make the case for mixing quickly, is to remain objective and not lose objectivity in your music. So it's really important to have a second pair of ears, whether that's another musician or even just a layperson, and asking them what you think. Does it sound balanced? How is everything sitting together? All those things. Having a second pair of ears is super important. And Alan Meyerson calls it having an adult in the room, which I love. So it's like having someone who has more of an objective view and is listening, to the mix for the first time. They can give you a more objective answer compared to what you might think if you've been listening to the same thing for like hours on end, And that leads me to another point. It's like always take breaks when you're mixing. So as soon as I start to feel myself having ear fatigue when I'm mixing, I usually take a break for about 10-20 minutes just to let my ears calm down. Maybe I'll listen to another piece of music that I think is really well balanced, and then come back to it and continue. So there we go. Next tip, number 5, was from Alan, and he said, determine what you want the low end of the track to be. Whatever else has low end, get rid of it, right? So for example, guitars might have, they may be really well recorded in a room, for example, but if the room has this low end rumble that kind of builds up in the sub frequencies, over time and over the course of many tracks being added together, that low end can actually complicate the mix and add too many unwanted frequencies. So what we want to do is figure out which instruments are actually contributing to the low end. For example, the bass, the timpani, the tuba, all these instruments. And then for the instruments that are not contributing to that low end and might serve only to clog it up, you want to apply like a high pass filter or a low cut. And this will result in a much more balanced mix. So if you're aware of my my 6-step mixing guide, this is, I think, the second step I usually apply. The second step I usually do. So I'll actually apply an EQ to all the individual tracks, and I'll actually apply a high pass filter to all the instruments that don't need that excess low end, right? So mid-range instruments and high-range instruments, I tend to apply like a cut, a high pass filter or a low cut filter to the bottom end, just to cut out those unwanted subfrequencies, because that's where it can really build up quickly. So you want to just be careful there. Tip number 6 was from Ian Shepard. He said, get good reference tracks. So know what you want in mind and find references that sound like that track. Okay. So in my case, if I'm trying to write a Disney piece of music and I want it to sound very uplifting and larger than life, then I have specific pieces in mind that I know that I kind of want it to sound like. So Super Mario Galaxy 2's Sky Station Galaxy, Super Mario Galaxy's Gusty Garden is also a really nice mix. Lot of just really clean and polished mixes are ones I try to strive towards when it comes to like really clear and detailed soundtracks. So I think it's really, really good to remember what you want in mind. So as soon as you have like an idea of what you want your mix to sound like, try to find a piece that sounds exactly in that same vein of style of mix. Download that, put that into your session, and then that will give you the opportunity to A and B back and forth between your mix and the polished final master. Just make sure that that commercial track, you pull the volume down so it matches the volume of your track, right? Because you don't want to be influenced by volume differences. Very important. Number 7 is on gain staging. So one of the questions was, what is gain staging and how does it really work, and what's important to remember? So Ian basically shared that gain staging is when you try to get the most optimal level at every stage of the mix. Optimal level just means volume. So when people say levels, they usually mean the volumes in relationship to each other of the instruments. So in digital, like most of us are working with digital gear instead of analog outboard gear. In digital, we don't want to clip, which means hitting 0 decibels. So we don't want to clip, which distorts the sound, but there's no point also in having the peak meters down really super low at like minus 50 decibels, because that's way too low and you barely hear anything. So having the peak levels, which just means like the loudest part of the song, having the loudest peaks be between -6 and -10. So -6 and -10 decibels is good, especially in 24-bit, which we're usually working in. And this is what I feel like most people try to aim for, this level anyway, because when you start to master and bring up the level, the volume of the entire track, you try to bring it to about -2, -1 dB. And the purpose of the brick wall limiter is to prevent your signal from actually hitting 0 and clipping. So anyway, try to have your peak levels between -6 and -10 dB on your master. That's very important. The whole point is you want to keep everything at a sensible volume level that outputs a good amount for your plugins, for example. Because actually plugins have a certain volume level for the tracks, for the instruments that work really well at that certain level. So yeah, for the master bus, try to aim for -6-ish peak before any plugins are applied, and then after the plugins, then you can you might end up bringing the level up just a touch more. But I think between -10 and -6 is a good range to go for. The next tip is on reverb. So this was talked about by Joel and the other guys as well. But Joel said for more close mic'd instruments, for example, something that's really dry, use a room reverb as an insert on the track. So on the plugins, on the track itself, you can actually apply a room reverb, and this will create the first layer of early reflections for that instrument. And it also creates a natural ambience around the sound, right? That's what a room reverb does. Then you can actually send the track to a secondary reverb for unity, because if you have an external reverb on a separate auxiliary track and you're sending different instruments to it, then that reverb will tie all those individual instruments together, because it's essentially saying that those instruments are in that room, right? But you want to make sure you have an initial reverb on that instrument to at least to give it some early reflections, and not just a long tail. You want it to have early reflections as well. So that's when the signal initially hits like the walls, for example, when the sound like hits the walls and comes back and the mic picks it up. So those are kind of the early reflections, and you want those to be present in your close mic'd instruments, or else it just sounds like a close mic'd instrument, but then with a lot of reverb at the end. It doesn't really make sense to our ears like that. Almost there. Tip number 9 was from Joel and Ian, and they mentioned to filter out the low and the top end of reverbs, which I found really interesting. I mean, I personally don't really do that, but I might start doing that. And the reason you want to filter your reverbs is because they can build up, and they might contain some like sibilances, which would be like the high frequencies, or some rumble in the low end of the reverb that might be unpleasant, and again build up over time, just like how we do it with our individual instruments, and we use EQ to take out the low end of the low end rumble of the instruments. So kind of you can do the same thing with the reverbs, and some reverbs actually come equipped with EQ settings that you can take out the highs and take out the lows, and only bring out the mids of the reverb, which is really cool. And then the final takeaway that I got from this video is the discussion between headphones and monitors. And we kind of talked about this in a couple of live streams, but essentially headphones help you take the room out of the equation. However, monitors allow you to feel the physical aspect of the music, and that can affect your decision making. But the thing is, if you do decide to go with studio monitors, then you want to make sure your room is properly treated. And so what the speaker is outputting is not being affected by the configuration of the room, right? Because your room might be telling you that you have extra bass, or more bass than you think there is. So there actually might be less bass than you think in the actual mix itself. When you have headphones, it removes the room out of the equation. So if you mix on those, everything is you can hear it very, very clearly, and you'll be able to mix like that. But the only difference is that you can't really feel the music that way as much. So there's kind of a fine line between that. I mean, I personally like to mix on headphones, and then I'll check on my speakers afterwards just to make sure everything sounds good. I'll bring it to the car. I'll bring it to a speaker system in the house, for example. And most of the time it translates pretty well. So Alan said, if you need some form of acoustic treatment, if you're mixing on monitors, you should invest in some form of acoustic treatment, especially if you're mixing in the comfort of your own home. Most people's rooms are not configured properly to mix, right? So it's really important. But whatever you do, learn your tools. He said, if you have $10,000, spend $8,000 on sound treatment and $2,000 on speakers. It will sound better than just having $10,000 speakers. So his point is just that you can have the most expensive equipment, but if your room is lying to you, then it's not worth having that equipment, right? So having a proper configuration of your room and having the proper sound treatment is very, very important. And then invest in a good set of like monitors to accompany that. Cool. All right, and those are basically the 10 takeaways. So let me just quickly recap. Number 1, a single live instrument on top of your mockup can really, really help. Number 2, less is more. Number 3, let a more experienced mix engineer or mastering engineer show you what to do if in certain situations. Let them set up a template, let them make some gear recommendations, let them show you their signal chain. Having that aspect of mentorship is absolutely very important, and we're missing a lot of that nowadays with more and more composers and musicians coming up by themselves. Number 4 is having a second pair of ears, and that's very, very important to remain objective to your music. Number 5, determine what you want the low end of the track to be. So find those instruments that contribute to the low end and get rid of the rest of the low end. Number 6, get good reference tracks. So, if you have a sound in mind, find a track that has that specific sound, download that, bring that in, level match your mix and the reference track, and make sure that your mix sounds as close as possible to the reference track. Number 7, gain staging. Just make sure that the highest or the loudest level of your song is is between -10 and -6 dB on your master track, because you don't want it to get too close to 0 and potentially clip. You also don't want it too low, because then everything is a little bit too quiet, and then the signals themselves are just not really strong enough. But most importantly is not to clip or get to 0. Number 8 is the use of reverb. So for more close mic'd instruments, apply a room reverb on the initial instrument track, on the track itself as an insert, and then send it as a send to a secondary reverb, so you can have that early reflections plus the tail and combine together to really gel together. And finally, headphones versus monitors. Use monitors if you have a treated room and you really want to feel the music. But headphones will help you if your room is untreated, like mine is, and it will just help you get a really clear image of what's going on. Just make sure the headphones are relatively flat, so they don't have an artificial boost in the low end, for example, that tricks you into thinking you have enough low end when you actually don't. And that's pretty much it. Those are my 10 takeaways from Dirk's Mixing and Mastering Roundtable. Thank you so much for watching this video. And in case you're on your own mixing and mastering and you're not really sure what to do, if you don't really have a workflow to follow and you're not really sure how to just proceed through the process, I've actually put together a 6-step mixing checklist for you to download. So it's absolutely free. Just check the description box below and you can download my 6-step mixing guide, and I think it'll really help you. I mean, this is the this is the formula that I go through for every single mix that I do. And for me, like to me, it results in a good sound. So I hope you learned something from this video and from this guide. Let me know if you have any questions. Just leave them in the comments below or send me an email. And I'd be more than happy to hear from you. So again, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. And yeah, take care. Bye-bye.